The architecture of this room is designed to remind us that God towers above us. You step into a space like this and you feel, hopefully, uplifted. That's what we're gesturing toward. It isn't every day that we set foot in a room with a ceiling this high. We crane our necks. We look up at the God who towers above. That's who God is. It is his essence. Until at Christmas, Christ is born below. God is perfect and powerful, but at Christmas, Christ comes to us as a baby, inarticulate, weak. This means that God is not limited by anything, including strength. In the manger, Christ proves God's might by contradicting it. In the manger, Jesus establishes God's majesty by shedding it. In the manger, Christ shows God's power by surrendering it. I think that when we hear the word manger, we can let our minds be corrupted by Airbnb of all things. If you've ever been in a farmhouse, a real farmhouse, I ask that next time you're online, get on Airbnb and Google farmhouse. It will have very little to do with an actual farmhouse. Most of these shabby, chic, rustic, glamping, glamour farmhouses that people are putting together to rent to you. And we can mistake the manger for that sort of thing, something straight out of the Williams-Sonoma catalog, when in fact, the manger that Jesus was born into ought to make us think of the stink of cows stuck in a windowless basement. Ever walk by the Lincoln Park Zoo on a day the wind is blowing in the wrong direction, the farm part of things down there, right? Imagine that in a windowless basement. That's what a stable in first century Jerusalem probably was. It was in Bethlehem, probably was a small windowless room carved into the side of a hill. An unloved, ignored space where you put mulch and the rake you use 2 times a year. Dank as a ditch, a congress of stinks. It's almost sinister if you had or have a great aunt or uncle and you've ever been to their house and snuck down into the cellar, and the moment you got there you realized you really didn't want to be in that room and you go running back up. That's the manger Jesus is born into. A space to get out of the moment you're in it. Or the part of yourself that you pretend isn't real. That's another kind of manger. The part of yourself you pretend isn't real. Most of the time, and I've said this before, most of the time we present to the world our inn, not our manger. Think of the distinction between your living room and your storage closet, right? Most of the time we're presenting our inn and not our manger. So imagine this, the one who hung the stars in the midnight sky and causes blood to race through your veins this very moment, the author of all creation, wants to come and be with you, wants to be at your side. If you just hosted or were hosted or are hosting, you know what you do when someone wonderful comes to visit, right? You yell at your kids and break out the vacuum. Well, that's what I do. You clean. You make your space sparkle and gleam. You get everything ready for your guest. You prepare your inn. That's not where Jesus wants to be. He wants to be in the manger, in the part of yourself that makes you yell at your kids when you break out the vacuum, in the part of your life you pretend isn't real. Our inns are where we live, the surface of our lives. And they're crowded. There is no room for Jesus in my inn, and I suspect there's no room for him in yours as well. They're crowded, they're crammed with accomplishments and resumes, GPA, prideful busyness, and that perfectly prepared scene that I just posted on Instagram. There is very little room for anything in our inns but ambition and the rewards we receive for it. Monuments to self-sufficiency. Who needs the forgiveness of God in such a place? We don't need it. There's no room in the inn. We don't have room for it. When I was a kid, my family had a creche that was, and I don't mean to romanticize or idealize my childhood, it was far from perfect, but our creche was perfect. We had the perfect creche. I don't know what happened to it. I'm convinced that one of my sisters has it and hides it every time I come and visit, but it's lost to the ages. It was, some of you have probably had this or even have it, made by two Polish artists, one named Stanislavski, mid-century wood carvings. All the figures in it, I loved this about it when I was a child, and I love it more now. They were all bald, all the figures in it, and they all had featureless faces, so you could kind of project yourself onto the scene. A very kind of 50s, 60s, minimalist, very sleek but rustic at the same time. Just a wonderful creche. So I have tried to find another creche over the years and another nativity scene, and I haven't liked any of them. Time after time, we've gone and looked for one and haven't liked it. Callie, my wife, doesn't have the same sort of devotion to these things, but I thought even, and I got on eBay, looked at the Stanislavski one to try and buy it for my family, and I had this moment of my life is in so many ways an exact replica of the life that I grew up in, right? Live in a parsonage, work at a church, all these things, 3 kids. It would become a little creepy if I had that exact same creche. So we just went without. But I found a creche that seems as if it were made for me and for my family. I found it this year at St. Paul's Advent Christmas Market, formerly known as the Regifting Market, right? I found this great one. It used to belong to Sally Fletcher's mother. And I remember Sally Fletcher's mom. And it has a sort of 50s Hollywood vibe to it. It is a kitschy creche. Jeff told me that kitsch, he said this right at the beginning of Advent, and I loved it, that kitsch, Christmas kitsch, testifies to the incarnation. Sort of the Zen koan for you, right? Christmas kitsch testifies to the incarnation. What does that mean, Jeff? I asked him that earlier, and he broke it down for me. That these kind of earthy things that ought not to be all that glamorous or imbued with too much meaning. Think of the ugliest Christmas ornament on your tree that you just can't let go of, right? They take on a numinous, holy quality. They become imbued with something that is actually, in our sort of polarized way of thinking, the binaries we run around with, almost the opposite of what they actually are. A cheap trinket suddenly glows with holy meaning. That is testimony to the incarnation. An impoverished baby becomes the one that God is, right? So kitsch testifies to the incarnation. And this, so all of that is a preamble, so I don't insult Sally if she's here. This is a kitschy creche, right? It is. And it has a screen at the back of the thing. When you move the little figures around, you can see the screen that depicts the 3 wise men on camels at the top of a valley, and the stars beckoning before them. And this screen is straight out of a Cecil B. DeMille movie. I mean, it couldn't look any more like a scene from one of those films. So I loved the thing. I loved it so much I shopped early, privilege of working here, and I carried it home and I put it on the mantelpiece at the parsonage. And that night, our daughter had her smartest friend sleeping over, right? Smartest friend, too smart to be a Christian. And she walked right up to the creche and she said, "There's no Jesus in this thing. It's Christmas and there's no Jesus in the manger." And she started laughing, I think, at the fact that she was able to correct her Christian friend, her preacher's kid friend, right? Ha ha. So I could have said, "Hey, listen, It's December 14th. Christmas is in 11 days. Of course, Jesus isn't in the manger yet. He hasn't even been born. Ever heard of Advent? But what do you gain by winning an argument with a 15-year-old, especially a smart one, right? You don't gain very much. And she had a point, actually. Something was missing. Ironically, the next day when I came to church, Sally and Carrie gave me the baby Jesus, which I'd left behind in my hurry to get this thing home. So I placed him in the manger, still during Advent, and something was still a little off about the thing. I decided I didn't actually like it that much after all. And it wasn't until December 23rd that I realized, looking at the thing, all right, we've got the characters here, Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus, right? But you can't really go straight to the Holy Family when you're contemplating Christmas. It's like, I don't know, jumping straight into a hot tub, right? Little kids love to jump in the pool. Nobody cannonballs into the hot tub when they're at a hotel. I've never seen it happen anyhow. It's a little too much, too fast. You need some kind of point of entry to get into the deep meaning. So you can't identify with Jesus, Mary, and Joseph right away. We kind of want to identify with the wise men, the wise people, right? We're wise people, but they don't get there for a long time. If you set your creche up properly, they're sort of off at a distance. This creche had all of those characters. It had cattle, it had sheep, it had a donkey, it even had 2 little sheepdogs, charmingly. And that's when I realized there's no shepherd in this thing. This creche was missing a shepherd. And this shepherd, for me at least, is the point of entry into the story. So if the shepherd's not there, you can't really get to the story. I was sort of thinking this over, and I said to my wife, the shepherd's not in this thing. And she looked at it. She does not pile on nearly as much meaning onto the creche as I do. And she looked at it and she said to me, well, what are you engaging when you ignore the absence of the shepherd? What have you been engaging for the past 2.5 weeks? It's just moments like that when you love being married to a therapist. But it's a great question. I mean it. It's a great question. What was I engaging? What was I denying? I wasn't letting myself get into the story. I was holding it off at a distance. It's why I didn't like the creche that much. The shepherds run to the manger. In that regard, they're a little bit like some of the first witnesses to Easter who go running to the empty tomb. They race there. And what we want to do, as I was saying, is we want to take Christ in all of his glitter and glamour and holy glow, and we want to fit him into our inn, right next to the best parts of ourselves, the parts we lead with, the parts we name on our resumes. But it doesn't work. There is not room for Jesus in the places that we gleam and sparkle and preen. Karl Barth says it perfectly. Again, our inns, and we as their residents, are only the most apparent parts of our lives. Hidden beneath, there is a depth, a bottom, indeed an abyss. Out back, behind the inn you're living in, there is a manger. And in that manger, there is an ox, and there is an ass. And in that manger, we are mortal. We are broken. We are tired. And we pretend it doesn't exist. Our world pretends it doesn't exist. Think of all the empty posturing and waste and violence we could be spared if all of us would only acknowledge the truth of our manger. Because the truth of God, wants to live there with you. The Christ child lives out back in the manger, down in the dark place, in the stall. When I used to work in a restaurant, it gleamed out front, right? Everything was polished. Out back, there was this thing that you dumped the dirty grease from making French fries into. And every time I ever saw someone near this thing, they were dumping grease into it and smoking a cigarette at the same time. That's the manger. That's where Jesus wants to be. Think of that part of yourself. That's where he's born. Quite close to the animals, that's where he's born. The kings have to come and see him, and it takes a long time. The donkey and the cow witness his birth. That's where we find ourselves to be, or we could at least. Sighing, dying creatures, quite close to the animals. I think it's a strange thought, no doubt, but it also can feel so good to admit the fact of who we are, even though it's frightening. The manger can be a frightening place. Fear not, for see, I am bringing you good news of great joy for all the people. To you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is the Messiah, the Lord. That is what the angel said to the shepherds before they ran to the manger. Fear not. And Jesus could have been born in an inn. God is free to go wherever he wants to go. And he wanted to be born in a stable, in a shed, in a manger. God isn't ultimately interested in surfaces or superficial things. She sees right through the lies we tell about ourselves. God wants to live in the truth of who you are, in the muck and the murk, right where you need him. So step out of the inn, go back with the ox and the ass and the prep cook, smoking a cigarette, dumping used grease into a little vat. That's where the love of the living God is. Amen.